Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. And we're here with a bit of a special episode, an end of summer special episode. We're calling this, the esoteric history I learned on my summer vacation. But basically, we thought that Nikki, Kelly, and I would chat a bit about what we got up to this summer, where we went, and what we learned, because even though in theory we're vacationing, I suspect all three of us also look for the interesting history stories as we roam about. So here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hi, Jody.
Hey there.
And I was going to say, happy end of summer, but that actually doesn't sound very good.
Although it's been like a zillion degrees and 100% humidity in Nashville,
Yes.
so I am very happy to see the backside of summer.
Yeah. Congratulations on a fruitful summer, I'll say it that way.
Okay,
and,
yeah. I'll take
I
that.
like the fall. I like this time of year
That's
a lot.
my
Love a good
Favorite.
shoulder season.
Yes,
exactly.
favorite time of year.
Yeah. First off, listeners have noticed, we've been doing some reruns and stuff because we've been giving ourselves time off and we've been traveling and so forth. And so then we thought, oh gosh, well, I'd love to hear personally what you learned and what you saw and some interesting stories from your summer travels. And we also want listeners to do this too. So in a few episodes after we get some stuff from you all listeners, we'll read some of what you learned on your travels. So you can email us thisdaypod@gmail.com. You can find us on Twitter or Instagram or wherever. And just tell us, in a few sentences, an interesting historical story or tidbit or something maybe a little lesser known or a plaque you read or something like that you discovered on your summer travels. And we'll read a bunch of those in a few weeks, in a few episodes. But who wants to start? Who went where?
Well, I can start because I had probably the most low-key summer. As folks who follow me on Instagram might know, I just bought my first house, and so that consumed most of my summer. I assume you don't want to hear about the history of interest rates. So I punctuated all of that with travel to archives. So it was a little bit of work, a little bit of pleasure. But the thing that I have been thinking about and that really defined all of that archival travel that I was doing was the importance of place. So I went to the Reagan Library and saw some of the landscape that helped to shape Ronald Reagan as he was coming up in California. I went to Oliver North's his foundation, which is out in Dulles, Virginia, and got a real sense for his people and his work and all of those things. But what I want to talk about is one of the places that I went that really helped me to understand the person who lived there, and that is Valkill in New York, which is the cottage where Eleanor Roosevelt lived. This place, first of all, it's very cool. There's Valkill College and Stone Cottage. And Valkill was kind of the only place that Eleanor Roosevelt had to call her own. It was land given to her by Franklin Roosevelt. It was near Hyde Park, which is kind of that big mansion that FDR grew up on. It was near FDR's mother, and, Eleanor Roosevelt and FDR's mother had a really contentious relationship. So that she had kind of a room of her own was really, really important. And because it was being developed during the Great Depression, she started something called Valkill Industries with a lesbian couple that she was very close with. All three of them started it. They experimented with furniture manufacturing and things like that. That closed down in 1936, and then it just became her place. And walking around and seeing both how it felt to occupy that space, to walk in the long approach up to the house, to walk in the woods behind it that connect Hyde Park and Valkill and the Stone Cottage. It really does give you a sense of the space a person you're interested in occupied. And I just found it so important and so generative to actually be there in that space. And so if you're interested in a particular person or a period or something like that, my big message is go there, go see the places they occupied, because it gives you a sense of a person in a way that I hadn't really, I think, fully understood.
That's good.
Is that a trick you employ, Kelly, in your research as well? How do you think about that?
No, I think that's so important. When you can go to a space and actually interact with it in a way that is likely similar to how the people inhabited that space. I imagine like Eleanor took walks in those very
lots of them
same woods. Yeah. And so I don't know, there's like some sense of for like hallowed ground a little bit, especially, I mean, I love Eleanor Roosevelt. She can do no wrong in my book. And so thinking about being in those spaces and how people are coming up with their thoughts, their plans, their ideas, their dreams, something about that's really special.
You know, Valkill is, that's like, I'm in that area a lot. My parents live like 10 minutes north of there. And one of my stories is from that same little area, so I know the sort of topography of it. But is there anything that particularly informs your understanding of Eleanor Roosevelt, by that area or this stone cottage? I'm looking at photos of it now. I mean, it's very clearly like, you know, upper society, early mid 20th century. But like, what else does it tell you?
Absolutely. I mean, it's been really well preserved. You know, Hyde Park, of course, immediately after Roosevelt died, becomes property of the United States. And so that's been preserved in a particular way as well. I think that it is both the combination of, yes, it's high society, but in that rural escape high society. I also went to like the Vanderbilt mansion up in Hyde Park, and that's just like scale wise so different, right? It's like these huge elk heads, and the scale of it is vast, and the views are vast. And that is one way of being a very wealthy person in a kind of rural area. Roosevelt's space wasn't like that. Like, it definitely was, you know, it's clear that somebody who had a lot of money lived there, but the scale of it was much more intimate. And I actually think that speaks to the importance of the personal for Eleanor Roosevelt. Like, she wanted spaces where she could just be, where she wasn't performing, where she could go for a walk in the woods, where she could look out at like beautiful flowering plants and a quiet little lake and a trickling little stream. And those kinds of things were an escape for somebody who had a very go, go, go kind of life, right? She was writing her My Day columns. She was First Lady of the United States. She was constantly involved in activism. So you get a sense of what a retreat from the world looked like for her. And that's what I found. You know, I'm not writing a book on Eleanor Roosevelt, but I felt like I understood.
Maybe
I know, I was like, maybe.
I'm not currently writing a book on Eleanor Roosevelt, but it gave me a sense of like that space. And that stone cottage is right next to Valkill. So you also understand the closeness and intimacy that she had with this couple that she was working with, who would continue to live in that stone cottage for decades. And, you know, a lot is made of the, you know, kind of interesting thicket of sexualities around Eleanor Roosevelt, something that historians have paid more attention to in recent years. And so I think that idea of intimacy and the way one lived when one was outside of the public eye seems like an important thing to tap into.
For whatever reason, I know why, because I really thought the movie was very impressive, and I've just been thinking about it a lot. But, you know, I'm thinking of Oppenheimer here, just in the sense of one of the many ways I was really moved by it. I thought I'm realizing that sort of sense of space and the fact that Los Alamos desert area had a real family connection to him, but also it was just so strange that they were like building this community and isolating themselves way out in the middle of nowhere, and that had all sorts of ripple effects. And then even also those, I don't know if you've seen. Did either of you see it?
I've seen it. Yeah, I've seen it.
I'm on the Barbie side of the Barbenheimer spectrum.
I saw both. I saw
both too.
But Barbie, you know, sense of space.
I was about to say
Yes.
Barbie Land, like cut off from the rest of the world. Isolation.
That Barbie mansion,
But it really tells you a lot. When you look at her space, it really tells you a lot about her character.
There are no
development,
stairs
and
from
you
the
come
second floor to the
understand-
first.
I know.
But even those scenes in Oppenheimer that are very important of Einstein, and just this idea that like, oh yeah, Einstein's just like wandering around suburban New Jersey, you know? It's like, I don't know.
Hanging around on ponds and lakes.
Right. So that's all to just reiterate. I think that a real deep understanding has to reckon with space in a really interesting way. One last thing, and then Kelly, I want to hear about your travels. But like, did you feel like you learned anything about Reagan from visiting the Reagan Library, or does the Reagan Library kind of like recognize what you're saying? Does it live in space and acknowledge space in that way?
The Reagan Library is one of those presidential libraries that makes the most of the landscape around it, in part because it is in one of the most beautiful parts of the country. It is just inland from Malibu, and so in these kind of rolling hills of Southern California. It's a gorgeous space. So of course, there are like tons of windows. There's tons of landscaping looking out over it. And the Reagan Reagan Ranch actually isn't in that area. This like the Thousand Oaks area. It is actually a little bit further, I guess, north and west. California has a weird curve right there in Rancho del Cielo. But I do think that it's important because, you know, as somebody who doesn't spend much time on the West Coast, and actually I hadn't been to California for years, in part because of the pandemic, in part because it's not really where I'm oriented, it's such a distinct landscape. It is so open and lush and gorgeous, and it just feels so different from being on the East Coast.
Yes, it does.
Right? And I think that it does speak to Reagan's sense of independence from the East Coast and from the culture of the East Coast, and also just his attitude, his style, the image that he cultivated was very much rooted in California. And it's not like I just learned that going out to the Reagan Library, but it really reinforced, that where we live and grow up and where we spend our time has a lot to say, not just about like how we think about ourselves, but about our politics as well.
Yeah.
Cool. All right. Who's next? Kelly, you want to go?
Yeah, I'll go. I had one of the busiest summers I've had to date. My summers are always busy, but this was exceptional.
Next level.
Yeah. I started out like the summer in Antigua. I ended the summer in Ghana and Martha's Vineyard. And then somewhere in the middle, I went to Chicago to see Beyonce. It was great. But like one of the highlights, at least in terms of history and historical markers, is I got to go to the Berkshires for a conference and a retreat, but also I got to see like the birthplace of W.E.B. Du Bois. And for me, like Du Bois is GOAT when it comes to history, sociology, like African American studies. All of his books have like shaped my thinking in some major way. Black Reconstruction is just like one of my go-tos, my all-time favorite books. So to be able to see where he was born, like his birthplace, his homestead, and to see that space is really run down and that there are signs there that are not really cared for, that some of them are covered in bird poop. There is a trail in which there are fallen trees down, so it makes it very difficult to sort of get through the trail. Then when you get there, there's no marker, there's no like foundation, there's nothing that sort of says like this was where the home was. And it's kind of sad. And I was like, I'm writing a letter to the University of Massachusetts Amherst, because they are sort of the landlords, if you will, of that space now. They own that property. But I got to tour it with like David Levin Lewis and a lot of other scholars who were there in that space for that conference. And it was really cool for me to be there because when I went to Ghana, I got to go to Du Bois's like death place, his final resting place. And that too was also kind of depressing. And I say this in that, you know, you have such big, huge admiration for like these giants in your field. And when you see sort of like how or where they were born and where their final resting place is, and that it's not as grand as you might think it would be, or as sort of like, I don't know, salutatory, it can be sort of a letdown. So when I got to the house, you walk in, it's a modest home, I think, especially for the area in which it's in, but you walk in and it kind of smells like mothballs, and that was kind of like, oh man. and then you know, they take you into like the living room area, they take you to his office, and that was crazy because they're all like the first editions of his books. So there is like a first edition of Black Reconstruction, of the souls of Black folks, of like the Philadelphia Negro. And I'm like, oh my God. And there's no preservation. You could literally just pull the book off the shelf. I'm like, where is the security? It was that was the only room that had air conditioning in it, because they said that they're like, oh yeah, we realized that in order for the books to be well preserved, they need to be in a cold space. So we run air conditioning in this room, just this room. And I'm like, God, that is not sufficient. That is not sufficient. So, yeah, I realized that, like, I don't know, if there are big donors out there, like, we need you to, like, dump money into Du Bois's final resting place. But it was cool to see his graduation, his commencement regalia from Harvard and from other places, to see where him and his wife Shirley made a life for themselves in the final years of their life. Du Bois passes away the day before the March on Washington. And so it was really neat to like see his gravesite and see all of sort of the schools that he either attended or taught at. So to see a big Howard banner was cool, or a Fisk banner, and he's the first.
But the Howard banner was
I know that was what was made for me. And then the there's a Harvard banner as well, and it was just I don't know. It was very sobering, I think, when you think of someone who is so big, to see how their birth and death is so modest or meek. There's a lot to take in. But I'm happy that I got to do that both in the summer, to see that. And then I took one day trip to the Gold Coast to see the slave dungeons, to see Elmina Castle. These are the places in which enslaved Africans were kept and sort of housed until they were put on ships and sent to the New World. And it's one of the largest slave castles on the West Coast. And that was intense. That was people warned me, people told me that like the dungeons have a smell, and they do, that they are dark, that they are dank, that they can be very intense places to stand in. I'm grateful that the tour guide though was very knowledgeable, very, very good. But there's a lot of I have critiques. Maybe it's the scholar in me, but like there's a lot of cognitive dissonance. Like you're going in, especially me as a Black American, being in this space and seeing this plaque on the wall that's right next to the cell where they kept enslaved people that were rebellious, and they threw them in the cell basically to leave them to die. They starved them to death. And then you see the plaque that says, we are the children of those who refuse to die. And that idea of like coming back into the same space in which people were said they could never return, the door of no return, that was very, very humbling, and at the same time upsetting, because people are taking selfies in the dungeon and they are smiling in their pictures. And in the middle of the tour, we take a pause to shop at the gift shop. And I was like, who wants to buy a t-shirt now? Do you know what I mean? Like there was a lot of moments where I was like, this has got to be reconfigured. And at the end of the tour, they were like, there's a restaurant and bar inside the slave dungeon. And I'm like, who wants to eat now? And then
tequila shots, everyone.
I know. My friend was like, you might think you need a drink after a tour like this. I was like, well, that's true. But it was, I don't know, me trying to hold all of these extremes in my head, in my heart, this like birth and death and life and violence and return and redemption and capitalism, like it was a lot. It was a lot.
Yeah.
You're used to hearing my voice on the world, bringing you interviews from around the globe.
And you hear me reporting environment and climate news. I'm Carolyn Beeler.
And I'm Marco Werman. We're now with you hosting The World Together. More global journalism with a fresh new sound.
Listen to The World on your local public radio station and wherever you find your podcasts.
I'm curious, Kelly, on the W.E. Du Bois front, there seem to be sort of two things that you're reacting to, and one of them is the modestness of both his birth and death place, and the other is the memorialization. How do you kind of separate those as you're thinking about the complex feelings that you had in both of those spaces? I mean, I wanted Du Bois to have more. Like, I know how other sort of big historians or big wigs in their field get plaques and statues and, all this sort of, pomp and circumstance. And
the fact that, he wasn't able to return to the United States. They basically don't renew his passport, so he can't return. And I think the tragedy of that, the grief, the loss of having your country sort of reject you after being a champion of like freedom and justice and civil rights and social rights, like, I don't know, maybe it's fitting, maybe when we think about the people that do this work, like we should be reminded that a lot of it is thankless and that a lot of it won't get sort of the gold medal at the end of the podium that we are, sort of all expecting. And that's what makes this work so hard. Like when they talk about commitment, like you have to be committed. It's like to the point of what if no one sees or appreciates what you're doing? Now, I know that's not true, like in the academic circles, Du Bois is beloved, but I think in the larger global space, the public, how people think of him, I still don't think he's the household name he should be.
Mm-hmm. Though that tidbit you mentioned, which I didn't know until actually I was reading about the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington, but that tidbit that he died the night before the March on Washington, I mean, it's just so incredible.
Yeah. And King says it. He says it in his speech. He's like, we want to take a moment of silence. Dr. Du Bois has just died.
So that was... Yeah, that was what I, that's how I learned about it, is seeing that during the March on Washington, they do a moment of silence. So there was some level of acknowledgement there and dignity there, I think, and some sort of sense of his contribution. But yeah, I agree. Especially, Great Barrington, Massachusetts should be able to put up a
absolutely
good plaque and keep the room.
A museum, a freaking museum. There should be much more than just like a, little historical marker, certainly.
Yeah. And certainly your conflicting feelings about tourism at some of these sites is, one of my best friends in the world works in public programming at the 9/11 Museum. And I mean, they grapple with this all the time. People, it's on the tourist circuit, people go there, they take selfies, I don't think they have a bar, but it is, it is something. And, I think for a lot of folks, I'm not going to speak on his behalf, I think for a lot of folks, it's like, we do our job to kind of tell the story as responsibly as we can. And you can only do so much about how tourists are going to behave, and time and memory work the way they work.
And merchandising, because even when I went to like the Titanic Museum in Belfast, there's like, I get the Titanic t-shirt or the Titanic mug, but they had like Titanic underwear. I was like, really? What?
So,
what are we doing?
It's a disaster area here.
I know. What are we doing?
But you felt like the sort of programming, putting the like way tourists were behaving, and maybe some of the like bar and restaurant stuff. But did you feel like the programming and the information that was at least provided on the tour was like contextualized?
Yeah, hands down. That was so good, so rich. I mean, the tour guide, he did a really, really good job of, I think, contextualizing it, giving you the gravity of what enslaved Africans were experiencing in those dungeons, But I think it's hard. You don't go on a tour with just Black Americans. It's everyone from all over that's engaging in these practices. And not everyone comes with the same historical baggage, if you will, when they show up to these sites. And so, I think there's is there a place for tourism capitalism? I guess. But when you're at a slave site, I don't know. It just feels out of place. So,
Well, at least no one did that. I don't know why I pulled this from the recesses of my brain, but no one did that thing where... Remember that story when Justin Bieber went to the Anne Frank Museum?
What
do you remember this controversy?
No.
He wrote, whatever, it's Justin Bieber, it's fine. But he wrote in the like log guest book, he was like, I'm sure she would have been a believer in her life or whatever. And in his mind, he was paying tribute to her, shout out to Anne Frank or whatever. But like,
well, I don't think Du Bois would have been a believer.
So that's right. But I don't know. I think about that sometimes.
Du Bois would have liked my book.
I know.
Exactly.
There's a time and a place, people.
Yes. Anyway, okay. Well, I will bring us home here and talk a little bit about my travels. I mean, I also had a very rich summer. It's really wonderful. I haven't even really taken a breath and kind of looked back. But actually, one very small thing that jogged in my memory when you were talking about the Hudson Valley, Nikki, is I spent a lot of time up there this summer as well, and I actually went out of my way and paid a little visit to that statue of Sybil Luddington, who was that young girl who did that
Oh, right,
midnight ride in the
yeah.
Hudson Valley.
Oh,
I
yeah,
happened to
yeah.
realize, I'm like, oh, I'm right near that town. And I actually went back and listened to our episode to hear the town. And then I found it as I was driving up. And so I saw the statue and kind of got a sense of like the place where Sybil was sort of doing her
That's cool.
midnight ride
Incredible.
that was obviously not as famous as Paul Revere's midnight ride. But anyway, so that was one early in the summer. But then, the last few weeks of the summer, I just got back. I think I'm still pretty jet lagged. I just got back a couple days ago. Was for me, years in the planning, this big trip to East Africa that I did with my parents, my daughter, one of my sister, my wife, the whole family, 3 generations trip to Zanzibar and Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. And, my parents lived in Tanzania for 10 years. I was actually born in Dar es Salaam, but I left there, we left when I was 2. But it still feels like a place we're all connected to, and going back with my parents, seeing the place where I was born, spending time with like some of their close friends who still live there. And in particular, we spent a week on Zanzibar, which is just a really fascinating place, and it's where our close family friends live. But, Zanzibar is this little island off the coast, and it's for centuries been a huge trading hub, and it's kind of famous for its spices and trade, and was obviously the slave trade went through Zanzibar as well. And, like a lot of places, it kind of reflects, and it really reflects still to this day, like the various waves of people who traded through there or colonized there and came through. And so, like the Portuguese were the first to colonize, and then there's like a big Arab influence. The Sultan of Oman made Zanzibar his sort of hub, his home for a while. And then, of course, there's British colonial influence, but a lot of that came through India. And so there's a really heavy Indian community and influence in the area. And that's where our family friends trace back to. So we ate very, very well. And then, of course, there's the local African culture. And kind of, I was talking to my folks who, my mom was the one who dragged my dad to East Africa to do academic work. And so a lot of her friends kind of study the region. And one of the big interesting conversations around people who are sort of trying to understand the history of Zanzibar is this question of like, for a while, I think people thought of Zanzibar as like the story of Zanzibar as one of these like these waves of different influence from these different parts of the world, like I just mentioned, and they would come and then one would crest and then recede and the other one would come along and they would sort of take over for one another, and you sort of thought of it as these successive waves. And more recently, I think there's been a real push to understand that, like, no, there's this existing African culture there, and that these waves should best be seen as kind of like variating and adjusting the existing ongoing culture, which never really went away. It just got molded and reshaped and rebalanced. And so there's just like a very interesting historiographical conversation about a region like that.
I love that. I love that.
Well, in 10 years is a long time to live someplace. As you were
Yeah.
saying,
Yeah.
I was like, I haven't lived 10 years anywhere other than my hometown. And so your family must have been like pretty heavily steeped in
enmeshed.
the area. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Had they gone back since?
Yes, they've gone back a bunch of times, but, this particular moment was, if I'm being honest, the real window we felt like where my folks can still travel. My daughter's old enough to be able to sort of really, I think, seep this in. Everyone could make it happen. So it's just like really, really special
That's
in that
great.
way. But a couple other tidbits about Zanzibar. Well, one is like that story I just told about the different waves of influence. I mean, you see it in the architecture, you see it in the people, you see it in the languages. You obviously see it in the food.
Yum.
And that's the thing that like really jumped out at me, and like many of the restaurants reflected that. And I will never forget, there was one dinner we went to where there was a buffet, and it was literally like at the buffet it was like beef Wellington, samosas, fresh fruit, and shawarma. And it was like, okay, you got like the colonial food, you've got the local produce, you've got the Indian food and the Arab food, and it was just like, oh right, here is the story of this place.
What language are most people speaking?
It's so Kiswahili is the language along the Swahili coast, as it's called, which is Kenya and down along the Indian Ocean, and that language also is like very much a product of. I mean, it was developed as a trading language first and foremost, but it has words from Arabic and it has words from local languages, and it has so it also reflects that mix.
Wow.
So I have to ask, since both of you went a lot further afield than I did, what was the best or most interesting thing you ate while you were in these places?
Oh man, hands down, jollof rice. Like, I had that every single day. and I never got sick of it. Jollof rice and Coca-Cola.
With like the real
day.
cane sugar.
Yeah. And I was not mad about that. I was told as Americans you can't eat like lettuce or some of anything that's not really cooked.
Mm-hmm.
So I tried to stay away from anything that was raw, like raw vegetables and things like that. But a lot of hotels know that tourists are coming, and so they have purified water that you can drink from and ice that you can put in your cup and all that stuff. But it was the rice for me.
Yeah. I mean, I think just the Indian food I ate at our family friend's house was just incredible. And actually, then another place. Actually, this reflects the kind of mix too. There was like a passion fruit chutney. So it's like local produce chutney jam kind of thing that like I have to track down. It was incredible.
That sounds amazing.
Wait, can I tell you one other tidbit?
Yes.
Yeah.
Interesting thing about Zanzibar. Freddie Mercury was born there.
Really?
Yeah.
No way.
And actually, again, like through Freddie Mercury's story, you can kind of it is this story because so his parents were Parsi Indian, which is from Western India, and they actually practiced Zoroastrianism. And there was a little Zoroastrian. I mean, Zoroastrianism used to be much bigger than I gather it is now. But there was a little Zoroastrian community actually on Zanzibar. But his dad was basically a civil servant. He worked in the colonial office for the British colonial office and got like a job in Zanzibar as a postal clerk or something. And so that's what took them there. But it was sort of through the larger British Indian Ocean colonial enterprise. But yeah, Freddie Mercury was born in Zanzibar. There's actually a really great museum like in the house where he was born that actually does a lot of that kind of like larger cultural context in addition to like they have his suit from the famous tour in 70 or whatever,
That's pretty cool.
So that was really
Yeah.
cool. It's a good little tidbit. I mean, he was only there for a few years, but he talked about it and he wrote about it.
One day they'll have a Jody Avirgan museum in
But anyway.
Love it. I love it.
Cool. Well, I think we all had really fascinating summers, and I think they informed our thinking a lot too. And so we want to hear from you, listeners. Write in. Couple lines. Tell us what you learned. The more kind of interesting or
Esoteric.
the more esoteric, the more it kind of like changed your thinking about something maybe you already knew or were interested in, the better. So email us thisdaypod@gmail.com or find us on Twitter or Instagram or wherever, and we will read a bunch of those and react and have some stories to tell in a few episodes. But we will leave it there for now. As always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt. Thanks to you.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.